Okay guys, welcome back to this series on how to make genre-based games. This video is looking at non-linear gameplay and sandbox modes of play. So let's find out what awaits us in the RPG genre.
You know not what awaits you, gifted one.
The core mechanics of role-playing games tend to revolve around two things: story and numbers. Most RPG games have these to a lesser or greater degree. But unlike the adventure or strategy genres, where you're usually experiencing a pre-existing story with maybe one or two differences, RPGs have hundreds of different story branches and allow the player a high degree of freedom in the game to make decisions. What's more, RPGs tend to have a high degree of non-linear gameplay. So what is that? Well, imagine a classic game like Mario. The player travels across 8 worlds, each of them comprising of 4 levels. The player travels from 1-1 to 8-4 in order and doesn't really deviate from that order at all. This is linear gameplay, because the player moves along a straight line towards their goals. And it's not just Mario using linear gameplay. RPGs do things slightly differently. They are story-based games, and the main story, also sometimes known as the main quest line, does pretty much follow a linear A to B to C structure in most cases. But where RPGs are different from adventure games or even story-based shooters is that they also allow the player to follow side quests. These are self-contained missions that may or may not interact with the main questline. They tend to be dotted around the world of the game, meaning that the player can encounter them in any order. This makes for non-linear storytelling, as the quest line looks more like this. Depending on the decisions players make in the side quests, different options may open up or close down on the main quest line. Most of these decisions tend to fall somewhere on the continuum between good and evil, and whilst other RPGs do different things with this idea, the decision for the player is the time-honoured question. Planning the dialogue for something with this many options tends to look something like this. Flowcharts enable the designer to visualize where the different responses in conversation will take the player and avoid getting stuck in dialogue loops. Most of the game, when the player isn't making interesting story decisions, will be taken up interacting with other characters, often NPCs or non-player characters. These computer-controlled characters offer up everything from opportunities to buy items, train skills.
What you have already learned in a few days took even the most gifted of us years to achieve.
Fall in love, and of course, fight. And most of these interactions are governed by the player's statistics, just one of the many number-based systems used in RPG games. Progression through an RPG is dominated by another number-based system, XP, or experience points. The player tends to earn XP through the interactions listed above, and by advancing key bits of the story. Once they have enough XP, they can level up. Depending on the game you're playing, this can mean a range of different things, but it usually involves some form of improvement to your character's base statistics. As the game goes on and the player levels up more and more, their character's stats get better and better, and so they're able to take on harder and harder challenges. This is how the game remains balanced. In order to explore how these ideas are done in practice, we need to look at a couple of games. I'm going to explore one big-budget AAA game, and, because budding games designers are not going to make Skyrim by themselves on their first try, I'm going to look at one lower-budget indie production. Skyrim is a fantasy-themed RPG set in the fictional world of Tamriel. It is a sword and sorcery story that deals with the return of dragons to the world after centuries of exile. player is thrown into the role of the Dragonborn, who is the one person who can mediate between humans and dragons.
Some believe that Dragonborn are sent into the world by the gods at times of great need.
This kind of chosen one role is often used for players in RPGs.
They cannot understand why I trust you.
You bested all of them. That's just one reason we chose you.
That you are the one who will watch over us for 1,000 years.
The realm of Skyrim, to the north of the kingdom of Tamriel, is vast, and the map is largely open world. This means that players can go anywhere and do anything in pretty much any order. There are two main quest lines, one to do with the return of dragons, the other to do with a political struggle between the Nords, who call Skyrim their home, and the Imperial Legion, who administrate Skyrim as part of the greater kingdom of Tamriel.
Damn you Stormcloaks. Skyrim was fine until you came along. Empire was nice and lazy.
As this very brief introduction suggests, the world of Skyrim is a vast network of interweaving stories and alliances. Skyrim is the fifth game in the Elder Scrolls series, each game building on the history and lore laid down in the previous games. All the games also expand on this lore through collectibles in things like books. Making your way through the game is tied to a levelling system, with some monsters only appearing once the player has reached a certain level. As with most things in RPGs, getting past these monsters involves using your number-based skills. Skill trees in Skyrim tend to be organised with the game's obstacles in mind. There are combat skills in shooting and 2 types of hand-to-hand, as well as blocking, 2 types of armour skill, and a range of magics depending on how you want to play the game. Destruction magics are for the killers, whereas illusion or conjuration magics might better suit those who want to explore without having to get into combat. But there are also skills like lockpicking, pickpocket, sneak, and speech, with a strength in each allowing different ways to play the game. By contrast, Dread Nautical is a tactical RPG from Hungarian indie team Zen Studios. The player can choose from one of 4 characters as they try to survive on board a ship that has been pulled into some dark dimension.
Welcome to my realm, child.
The game is structured into 20 levels, each one organised around a different deck of the ship. Whilst the player is fairly free to explore each level however they choose, the level structure of the game makes for fairly linear play. You have to complete Deck 1 before you can begin Deck 2. This ensures the player has time to level up properly before they encounter the really difficult bosses. Making your way through each deck involves defeating a range of enemies in turn-based tactical combat that is very reminiscent of the strategy genre.
Drago Drexler, the fastest draw in the... wherever the hell we are.
And also convincing the passengers and crew to join your little sanctuary down in the ship's hold.
Let's do what we can for the survivors.
You're right, of course. Let's start with collecting supplies.
Dread Nautical is big on crafting, and the collection of a scrap resource allows the player to repair and upgrade the weapons and other equipment that they find. Runes can be traded in to improve the statistics of the player and the NPCs who join you in your cause. In this respect, runes can be seen as similar to the experience points system in Skyrim, but instead of levelling up your character, you have to level up your crafting station in order to access the really powerful upgrades and improve your stats. And the game draws on a fairly familiar list of stats, including health, combat and defense stats, as well as increasing the number of action points you have to spend in combat, the size of your inventory, and the number of times you can use your special ability. When comparing an indie game like Dread Nautical to a massive AAA RPG like Skyrim, it's easy to see how big ideas can be scaled down for smaller releases. 2 melee skills become 1, 6 types of magic become 1 special ability per player character and NPC. Decisions like this allow for the sorts of customization that the player might expect from an RPG, without making the game so big and so sprawling that it becomes difficult for a relatively small team like Zen Studios to manage. There are further similarities between these two very different titles where conversation is concerned, with both games offering the player dialogue options that directly affect what NPCs think of you and how likely they are to join your team.
Wow, fantastic stuff. At least that's what I'd be saying if I believed a word of that crap you just spewed.
Planning for something like this clearly involves some kind of hidden charisma or influence statistic, with each response chosen adding to or taking away from it. Of course, the real trick in keeping that information hidden from the player is making them guess which responses are the most likely to get them what they want in any given situation.
No kidding.
Yeah, no kidding.
In terms of the level structure, Dreadnautical uses a clever reset button at the end of each deck to send the player home. Sounding the ship's foghorn causes the player to convulse, pass out, and wake up below decks. This is very different from the open world go-anywhere structure of a game like Skyrim, and helps to limit the number of options available to the player at any one time, so making for a smaller, more controlled gaming experience. If Dreadnautical is all about managing the player's list of options, Skyrim is about expanding it as much as possible. It does this in a way that is very close to, if not actually, sandbox play. Sandbox games tend to mimic the freedom of expression of a child's sandbox, hence the name, and often allow the player to do pretty much whatever they want to do. Planning for a sandbox game takes place around two things, in addition to all of the other things for open world games like Skyrim. Firstly, the designers need to have a list of common types of interaction that the player can have with the NPCs, enemies, and objects they might come across in their play sessions. This might include fight or build, gather resource, or go on a race. Programming each type of interaction might be time-consuming, but once it's done, it can be added to every appropriate type of object, enemy, or NPC in the game, meaning that wherever the player goes, there will always be something to do. The second issue is one of repetition. Even the largest sandbox game will eventually run out of things to do if the player can only interact with each object, enemy, or NPC once. Adding a repeat function means that they will never run out. For example, a GM script might limit the number of wolves allowed in the game to 10. Once the player kills one, another can spawn in a randomly assigned spawn point, so the total never drops below 10. One way Skyrim adds repetition is through Radiant quests. These are fairly generic quests like Kill the Bandit Leader that can be given by different characters in different locations. In a world like Skyrim, it is entirely plausible that there will always be bandit leaders, and that the fall of one will just give rise to another, so the player never runs out of things to do. Adding repetition in sandbox modes of play is becoming increasingly important as more and more games move to perpetually online worlds. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs, are full of such sandbox tricks in order to keep players coming back. A trick they have learned from mobile farming and Sims games, amongst others. In the next video, we take a look at farming and Sims games, exploring how they encourage sandbox forms of play, and how more and more games are becoming hybrids of several different genres, as things like monetization drive the sorts of features that get included in games. Thanks for watching, y'all.